Close your eyes. Imagine a building. Not a building like any you have ever seen. Not a building like any that has existed in the modern world, or in the medieval world, or in the world of ancient Greece or Rome. A building that stretches 300 meters in one direction and 250 in another. A building of 3,000 rooms, half of them underground, half above, connected by corridors so twisting and so numerous that even people who had lived in Egypt their entire lives required a guide to navigate them. A building whose roof was made of single stones, enormous slabs of granite and limestone laid across the top of the corridors like the covers of an impossible book. A building that contained chapels to every god of Egypt, that served as the administrative heart of an empire, that was described by the most meticulous travel writer of the ancient world as surpassing even the pyramids. This building existed. We know it existed because 6 separate ancient writers from 3 different centuries, writing in 3 different languages, visited it and described it. They wrote down what they saw with a specificity and a consistency that cannot be explained as invention or exaggeration. They disagreed on minor details. They agreed on the essentials. They all used words that amounted to the same thing. I have never seen anything like this. And then the building disappeared. Not gradually over centuries of slow decay, not in a single catastrophe of earthquake or fire. It disappeared in a way that is, when you examine it closely, almost as mysterious as the building itself. The stone was taken, block by block, slab by slab. The material of the greatest building in the ancient world was removed and used elsewhere, quarried, recycled, turned into the anonymous fabric of later construction, the individual stones untraceable, the building they had once composed reduced to a field of limestone chips and rubble. All that remained when the archaeologists arrived in the 19th century was a layer of debris, and beneath the debris, a massive stone slab too large to move, too solid to break. And beneath the slab, in 2008, a team of scientists pointed ground-penetrating radar at the ground beneath that slab. What they found changed everything. Tonight we tell the story of the Lost Labyrinth of Egypt, the building that was called the 8th wonder of the ancient world, the structure that Pliny the Elder said was the model for the mythological labyrinth of Crete, the wonder that 6 eyewitnesses described in detail and that has not been seen since the Roman Empire. And we follow the remarkable modern story of what may still be hiding beneath the sands of Hawara, waiting. So settle in, let the desert wind come, let the darkness gather, and let the mystery carry you gently to sleep. Chapter 1, Amenemhat III and the 12th dynasty. To understand the labyrinth, you first need to understand the man who built it. Amenemhat III. He was the 6th pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, the dynasty that historians consider one of the greatest periods of Egyptian power and cultural achievement, sometimes called the Middle Kingdom Golden Age. He ruled for approximately 46 years, from around 1860 to 1814 BC. 46 years. In a world where royal reigns were frequently cut short by illness, by warfare, by palace conspiracy, 46 years was an extraordinary tenure. It gave Amenemhat III the time to do what great rulers with long reigns do, to build. And he built. He was one of the most prolific builders in Egyptian history. He extended the irrigation works in the Fayoum, the great oasis region southwest of Cairo, a depression in the desert that had been converted into extraordinarily fertile farmland through centuries of engineering work. He built temples. He built monuments. He sent mining expeditions to the turquoise mines of Sinai and the gold mines of Nubia. And he built his mortuary complex at Hawara. The mortuary complex, the temple or series of temples that would serve the pharaoh's funerary cult after his death, was a standard feature of Egyptian royal construction. Every pharaoh built one. They ranged from modest to enormous, from simple to extraordinarily complex. Amenemhat III was something else entirely. The ancient sources who describe it are consistent on its location, near the pyramid he had built for himself at Hawara, in the southern Fayum on the edge of Lake Moeris, the great artificial lake that the irrigation engineers of the 12th dynasty had created and maintained. The pyramid was there. The complex that he built beside it was the building that the Greek writers would call the labyrinth. Why did he build something so extraordinary? The 12th dynasty was a period of administrative complexity as much as military power. Egypt had, during this period, developed a sophisticated bureaucratic state, with regional governors, specialist administrators, temples serving different gods, complex taxation and redistribution systems that managed the agricultural surplus of the Nile Valley. The labyrinthine complex at Hawara may have served as the administrative heart of all of this, a place where the business of governing Egypt could be conducted, where representatives of different regions and different gods could come, where the complexity of the Egyptian state could be physically embodied in architecture. 3,000 rooms, each one perhaps serving a specific administrative or ceremonial function, each corridor connecting different aspects of a bureaucratic and religious world that was itself labyrinthine in its complexity. The building, in this interpretation, was not merely a mortuary temple. It was a map of Egypt itself, a physical model of the administrative and theological structure of the most sophisticated state in the ancient world. Whether this interpretation is correct, we cannot be certain. We cannot excavate the building. We cannot walk its corridors. We cannot read the inscriptions that presumably adorned its walls. We can only read what the people who did see it wrote down. And what they wrote down is extraordinary. Chapter 2, Herodotus, the father of history, stands amazed. Herodotus of Halicarnassus, the father of history, the man who traveled the ancient world in the 5th century BC and wrote down what he saw and heard and was told in a work of 9 books that is one of the foundational texts of Western literature. He was a careful observer. He was not naive. He had seen the pyramids. He had seen the great temples of Egypt at Karnak and Luxor. He had seen the monuments that had been impressing visitors for 1,000 years before his own visit. And when he saw the labyrinth, he ran out of words. He visited Egypt around 450 BC. The complex at Hawara was already more than 1,300 years old by this point, built in the 12th dynasty and standing, somehow, through the chaos of the Second Intermediate Period and the glories of the New Kingdom and the long decline of the Late Period. It had survived over a millennium of Egyptian history. Herodotus described it in his histories in Book II with the kind of detail that characterizes his best writing, specific, comparative, struggling against the limitations of language to convey something that exceeded language. He wrote that the labyrinth had 12 courts, covered with gates facing one another, 6 on the north side and 6 on the south, all within one enclosing wall. He wrote of the passages, the endless, winding, confusing passages that connected the courts and the chambers, so complex that even a person familiar with the building could lose their way. He wrote of the transition from the upper courts to the lower ones, the underground portion of the complex, which he was forbidden to enter. The The priest who managed the building told him that the underground rooms held the burial chambers of the pharaohs who had built the labyrinth and the sacred crocodiles of the god Sobek. He accepted this explanation. He did not try to force his way into the underground. But he did examine what he was allowed to see, and what he was allowed to see was enough to leave him, the man who had seen the pyramids, struggling to find adequate words. He wrote, and this is the most famous passage in all of ancient writing about the labyrinth: "It surpasses even the pyramids." Let that sit for a moment. Herodotus had seen the pyramids. He had stood at the base of the Great Pyramid of Khufu and looked up at something that had been the tallest man-made structure in the world for 2,000 years. He was not easily impressed. And he said that the labyrinth surpassed even the pyramids. He went on, he wrote that the passages and the confusing turns defied all description, that the building was more than words could convey, that the rooms he saw were more than human strength could have built, an extraordinary statement, echoing the kind of awe that people feel when they encounter something that seems to exceed human capacity. He was a meticulous observer, writing in his most specific style. And he said it surpassed the pyramids. This is not the description of a man telling stories for effect. This is a careful, experienced observer encountering something that broke his categories. The labyrinth was real. Herodotus had been there. Chapter 3, Strabo, the geographer's testimony. Strabo was a different kind of observer from Herodotus. Where Herodotus was a storyteller, a traveler who collected and narrated, who brought the ancient world to life through human detail and vivid scene setting, Strabo was a geographer and a scholar. His great work, the Geography, was a systematic description of the known world, intended as a reference for educated readers who wanted precise information about places rather than entertaining narratives. He visited Egypt in the 1st century BC, when it was already under Roman rule, Cleopatra's Egypt, the Egypt of the final Ptolemaic period, a world in transition from the ancient to the ancient becoming medieval. And he went to Hawara. He described the labyrinth in his Geography with the precision of a man taking careful notes for future reference. Before the entrances, he wrote, there lie what might be called hidden chambers, long and many in number, and having paths running through them which twist and turn, so that no one can enter or leave any court without a guide. He described the roofs. This is one of the most remarkable details in any ancient account of the labyrinth, a detail that would prove significant in modern archaeological investigation. The wonder of it, Strabo wrote, is the roofs of each chamber which are made of single stones. A single stones. Not many stones fitted together, not brick or plaster, single monolithic slabs of stone, each one forming the complete roof of a chamber. Given the size of the chambers that the ancient sources describe, the size of these individual stones would have been extraordinary, slabs of granite or limestone larger than anything in any modern building, quarried and transporting and placed with a precision that remains difficult to explain even with modern engineering knowledge. Strabo also described something that Herodotus had not mentioned, or at least had not emphasized in the same way. He wrote of the sheer navigational complexity of the building, of the guides, of the impossibility of finding your way without someone who knew the passages. The labyrinth in Strabo's account was not merely large, it was deliberately disorienting. The passages were designed to confuse. The courts led into other courts in ways that no rational architectural logic could predict. It was, in his description, a building that embodied the experience of the mythological labyrinth, a structure designed to make the unfamiliar visitor helplessly lost. This detail has led some scholars to suggest that the building served a deliberate theological purpose, that the experience of moving through it, of becoming lost, and then being led through by a guide was itself a religious ritual, a symbolic journey through the complexity of the cosmos, guided by priestly knowledge, emerging eventually into light and understanding. The labyrinth as initiatory experience. Whether or not this is correct, Strabo's account confirms the essentials of Herodotus's description. The building was real, it was complex, it was roofed with single stones, it required guides. And it was still standing, still accessible to visitors in the 1st century BC. Chapter 4, Pliny the Elder and the Citns. Pliny the Elder, the Roman natural historian who died in the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, overcome by his own scientific curiosity, sailing toward Pompeii to observe the volcano and rescue his friends. A man who spent his life compiling knowledge. His natural history is 37 books of everything he could learn about the natural world, from astronomy to zoology, from geography to medicine. He wrote about the Egyptian labyrinth in his natural history, and he added a detail that none of the earlier writers had included. He suggested that the labyrinth was the model for the mythological labyrinth of Crete, the one that Daedalus had built for King Minos, the one that contained the Minotaur, the one that Theseus navigated with Ariadne's thread. Pliny wrote that Daedalus used this as the model for the labyrinth which he built in Crete, but it is equally clear that he imitated only the 100th part of it, which contains twisting paths and passages that advance and then retreat. This is a remarkable claim. It suggests that the Egyptian labyrinth was so well known in the ancient Mediterranean world that it had become the reference point for the idea of a labyrinth generally, that when the Greeks told stories about the impossible maze that imprisoned the Minotaur, they were drawing on knowledge of an actual building in Egypt that embodied exactly that quality of inextricable complexity. The word labyrinth itself may derive from an Egyptian or Minoan root. Scholars debate its etymology, but the connection that Pliny draws between the Egyptian building and the Greek myth is one of the most tantalizing threads in the whole story. Did the Greeks who first visited Egypt in the centuries before Herodotus see the great complex at Hawara? Did they carry home the memory of its incomprehensible corridors? Did that memory seed the stories of Daedalus and the Minotaur? We cannot prove it, but the connection is suggestive in ways that are difficult to dismiss. Pliny also described the building with his characteristic thoroughness. He wrote of the quartzite columns that held up the roof. He wrote of the 12 covered courts. He mentioned the crocodile god Sobek and the priests who tended the sacred crocodiles that lived in the pools within the complex. He wrote of the overall dimensions, and his dimensions, like those of the other ancient sources, suggest a building of extraordinary scale, hundreds of meters on each side, thousands of rooms, a structure that would have dwarfed any building in imperial Rome. Pliny's account confirms what Herodotus and Strabo had said. It adds the mythological connection, and it leaves us with the same fundamental question. Where did it go? Chapter 5, Diodorus Sicus Manetho, and Pomponus Mela. 6 ancient writers describe the labyrinth. We have met 3 of them. The other 3 add important details and confirm the overall picture. Diodorus Siculus was a Greek historian from Sicily who wrote in the 1st century BC, a contemporary of Strabo, compiling his enormous historical library at roughly the same time. He visited Egypt and described the labyrinth in terms consistent with the earlier accounts. He added something important. He wrote that the building was built jointly by the 12 kings of Egypt who had divided the country between them, a reference to a period of Egyptian history that scholars connect to the fractured political landscape of the 12th dynasty, when regional power was significant even under a strong central pharaoh. Whether this is historically accurate, whether the labyrinth was genuinely a joint construction by multiple rulers, or whether Diodorus was working from a tradition that had developed around the building's origin, it adds a layer to the mystery. A building that no single man could have built, and whose very complexity exceeded the imagination of any single architect. Perhaps the ancients explained this magnitude by attributing it to multiple rulers, just as we sometimes attribute overwhelming achievements to collective rather than individual effort. Manetho was an Egyptian priest who wrote in the 3rd century BC, closer in time to the period of the building's construction than any of the other ancient sources. He wrote in Greek for a Ptolemaic Egyptian audience, attempting to explain Egyptian history and religion to a world that was becoming increasingly Hellenistic. His references to the labyrinth are fragmentary, surviving only in quotations by later writers, but they confirm the building's existence and its association with the 12th dynasty pharaohs. Pomponius Mela was a Roman geographer who wrote around 43 AD, our latest ancient source on the labyrinth. His description is brief but consistent with the others. He mentioned the building in the context of describing the Fayum region, placing it near Lake Moeris, confirming the location that all the other sources also identify. 6 sources, 3 centuries of documentation, Greek, Roman, and Egyptian writers all pointing to the same thing. A building near the pyramid of Amenemhat III at Hawara. 3,000 rooms, 12 courts, roofs of single stones, passages that required guides, a scale that surpassed even the pyramids. All 6 witnesses agreed on the essentials. And then, at some point between the last of these witnesses and the medieval period, the building vanished. Not from the records survived, copied and recopied, carrying the descriptions of Herodotus and Strabo and Pliny through the centuries, but from the physical world, from the landscape, from the place where it had stood. The question of how is one of the most remarkable in archaeology. Chapter 6, How does a building vanish? The question seems simple, the answer is complicated. A building does not simply vanish, stone does not evaporate, 3,000 rooms do not disappear overnight. What happened to the labyrinth was not sudden, it was slow, it was systematic, and it was, in its way, entirely predictable. Egypt in the millennia after the 12th dynasty went through an extraordinary amount of change. The New Kingdom pharaohs of the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties were themselves great builders, and great builders need stone. The quarrying of new stone from the mountains was expensive and time-consuming. The reuse of existing cut stone from older monuments was efficient and practical. This practice, known as spolia, was universal in the ancient world. Roman buildings contained stones from older Roman buildings. Medieval churches contained stones from Roman temples. The Colosseum itself was quarried for its stone during the medieval period, much of it ending up in the fabric of later Roman construction. The same thing happened in Egypt on a massive and systematic scale. The temples and monuments of earlier periods were treated as quarries. The stone was too valuable, too perfectly cut, too precisely shaped to leave unused in a building that no longer served its original function. When a pharaoh's cult declined, when the priests moved on, when the administrative functions of a complex were reorganized, the building that had housed those functions became available for demolition. And the labyrinth was enormous. Its stone was extraordinary, the quartzite columns, the granite roof slabs, the limestone walls. Thousands of tons of perfectly cut, well-maintained, easily accessible stone. For someone who needed building material, it was an incomparable resource. The quarrying of the labyrinth probably began sometime in the later periods of Egyptian history, perhaps during the Ptolemaic period, perhaps during the Roman occupation. It continued steadily as the needs of later builders consumed the fabric of the earlier building, piece by piece, slab by slab, column by column. By the time the Arab conquest of Egypt brought a new administrative order in 641 AD, what remained of the labyrinth was already significantly reduced. The above-ground structure, the courts, the columns, the upper rooms was largely gone. What remained was the debris, a vast field of limestone chips and fragments, the detritus of demolition, covering an area of approximately 300 by 250 meters. The debris field was itself significant. It marked the footprint of what had been there. And beneath the debris, something else. Flinders Petrie, excavating at Hawara in the 1880s, found it. A massive stone slab, enormous, covering a significant area, lying beneath the debris field at a depth that suggested it had been there throughout the millennia of quarrying. Too large to move, too solid to break. Petrie interpreted it as the foundation of the labyrinth, the bedrock on which the great complex had been built, too deeply embedded to be practically useful to the stone quarriers who had dismantled everything above it. He was wrong about what it was, but the recognition of his error would take more than a century. Chapter 7, Flinders Petrie and the 19th century excavation. William Matthew Flinders Petrie, one of the founding fathers of modern archaeology, the man who brought scientific rigor to the excavation of Egyptian sites, who measured, who photographed, who recorded, who understood that archaeology was not treasure hunting but the careful reconstruction of the past from physical evidence. He arrived at Hawara in the 1880s with the full resources of Victorian archaeological practice, picks and shovels, Egyptian workers, measuring instruments, notebooks. He found the pyramid of Amenemhat III easily. It stood degraded, its outer casing long since stripped, but the mud brick core still visible on the southern edge of the Fayum. He found the debris field to the south of the pyramid, chips and fragments of limestone and granite, pottery shards, fragments of column, scraps of what had once been the greatest building in Egypt. In 1843, the German Egyptologist Carl Richard Lepsius identified the site of Hawara as the likely location of the labyrinth described by Herodotus. Later, the famed British archaeologist Flinders Petrie carried out excavations there in the 1880s. Petrie uncovered the remains of Amenemhat III's mortuary temple, confirming its massive scale. He found evidence of an extensive complex with courtyards, colonnades, and chambers, though in a ruined state. The ground plan, reconstructed from the debris, revealed a bewildering series of rooms and passages, supporting the ancient descriptions of a labyrinthine layout. From the patterns in the debris, from the distribution of the fragments, from the positions of the cut stones and the column bases, Petrie reconstructed on paper something of what the labyrinth had looked like. His plan, drawn from the evidence of what had been destroyed, showed a complex of extraordinary extent, hundreds of rooms, multiple courts, the general organization that the ancient writers had described. The reconstruction confirmed that the ancient descriptions were not fantasy. Something of extraordinary size and complexity had stood here. The debris was the evidence of its existence and its destruction. But Petrie also found the slab. Beneath the debris at a certain depth, was a massive stone, a pavement Petrie thought the floor or foundation of the complex. He noted its size and its solidity. He noted that it appeared to extend beyond the area he had excavated. And he moved on. He had confirmed that the labyrinth had existed at Hawara. He had reconstructed something of its plan. He had found the pyramid and the debris field and the massive stone slab. He concluded reasonably, given the evidence available to him, that the labyrinth was completely gone, that the debris field was all that remained, that the stone had been taken and the building destroyed. He was partially right. The above-ground building was gone. The quarrying had been thorough. But Petrie may have been wrong about the slab. And if he was wrong about the slab, then what lay beneath it was something that neither he nor anyone else had yet imagined. Chapter 8, The Question of the Roof. The turning point in the modern story of the labyrinth came from a rereading of Strabo. Strabo had described the roofs of the chambers as made of single stones. He had specifically drawn attention to this as one of the most remarkable features of the building. The wonder of it, he had written, is the roofs of each chamber which are made of single stones. For centuries, scholars had read this as a description of a building technique, the use of enormous monolithic slabs to span the chambers, rather than the more common arched or corbelled roofing methods. It was remarkable, certainly, but it was readable as simply a description of the upper structure of the building. But what if Strabo was saying something different? What if the single stones he was describing were not merely the roofs of individual chambers within the building, but were themselves a single massive pavement, a stone layer that served as the roof of an underground complex? The Mataha expedition, a team of researchers working in the early 2000s, proposed exactly this interpretation. They recalled what Herodotus had written, that the labyrinth had both an above-ground portion and an underground portion, that the underground portion was where the burial chambers were, where the sacred crocodiles lived, where he had been forbidden to enter. What if the building that Petrie had found evidence of the above-ground complex with its courts and corridors was not the main labyrinth at all, but merely its upper level? What if the real labyrinth was underground? And what if the massive stone slab that Petrie had found, the slab he had interpreted as the foundation of the above-ground complex, was actually the roof of the underground one? What if the labyrinth had not vanished at all? Or what if it was simply hidden? Beneath the slab, beneath the debris, beneath 3,000 years of accumulation and assumption. Awaiting. Chapter 9, the Amenemhat expedition and the radar. In 2008, the Mataha expedition went to Hawara. The team was assembled from multiple institutions, Egyptian and Belgian researchers, geophysicists and archaeologists, working under a permit from the Supreme Council of Antiquities of Egypt, headed at the time by Dr. Zahi Hawass. They brought ground-penetrating radar. Ground-penetrating radar, GPR, works by sending electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measuring how they are reflected back. Different materials reflect differently. Rock reflects differently from soil. Air reflects differently from stone. A buried wall reflects differently from the ground around it. By mapping the reflections, you can build up a picture of what is underground without digging, without disturbing the site, without the destructive process of excavation. The team pointed their equipment at the ground beneath the debris field at Hawara. Below the stone slab, at a depth of 8 to 12 meters, they found a grid structure of gigantic size made of a very high resistivity material, consistent with granite. The geophysics research confirmed the presence of archaeological features consistent with an underground complex. Using ground-penetrating radar, they discovered a vast subsurface anomaly, a rectangular pattern beneath the ground that spanned several hectares. The data revealed walls, chambers, and corridors deep below the surface, not natural formations, something constructed, something huge. The results were astonishing. The underground anomaly was consistent in its dimensions with the descriptions in the ancient sources. The rectangular pattern of walls and chambers corresponded to what you would expect if the labyrinth described by Herodotus and Strabo and Pliny was still physically present, underground beneath the massive stone slab that Petrie had found and misidentified. Around 3,000 rooms packed with magnificent hieroglyphs and murals, just as Herodotus described, possibly still intact, still sealed, protected from the quarrying that had destroyed everything above. The team published their findings. And then something happened that is, in its own way, as mysterious as the building itself. The research stopped. The Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities did not permit further investigation. Despite the groundbreaking findings of the 2008 survey, findings that suggested one of the greatest undiscovered archaeological sites in the world might lie just beneath the surface at Hawara, no excavation was permitted. The research team and the broader community of researchers interested in the labyrinth were left with the radar data and without the ability to physically investigate what it showed. Meanwhile, the site faced a new threat. Rising saline groundwater continues to erode what remains of this lost wonder, making preservation an urgent necessity. The same water table that has protected the underground complex from surface disturbance for 3,000 years was now rising, bringing salt water into contact with ancient stone and ancient pigments and ancient inscriptions, corroding from below what has survived from above. The clock was running. Chapter 10, What Might Be Down There? Let us allow ourselves a moment of speculation. If the Mataha expedition's findings are correct, if the ground-penetrating radar has identified a genuine underground complex at Hawara that corresponds to the labyrinth described by the ancient sources, what might be inside? The ancient writers give us clues. Herodotus was told that the underground chambers held the burial chambers of the pharaohs who had built the labyrinth. If this is true, if the underground complex at Hawara contains royal burial chambers from the 12th dynasty, then it may be the most significant undiscovered royal tomb in Egyptian history. The 12th dynasty is not well represented in terms of surviving burial equipment. The pharaohs of this period, Amenemhat III and his predecessors and successors, are known from their monuments, their statues, their administrative records. But the actual burial goods, the personal objects, the organic materials that tell us about individuals rather than institutions, these are largely missing from the 12th dynasty record. A sealed underground complex at Hawara, protected from grave robbers by its depth and its concealment beneath the massive stone slab, might contain precisely these things: coffins, jewelry, personal objects, organic materials, wood, textile, organic offerings that would normally decay, but that the dry desert conditions of a sealed underground space might have preserved. Herodotus was also told that the underground chambers held the sacred crocodiles of the god Sobek. Sobek was one of the most important gods of the Fume, the crocodile god, the one who watched over the Nile and its life-giving flood, whose sacred animals were maintained in pools within his temples and mummified with great ceremony after their deaths. If the underground complex held the crocodile cult of Sobek, There may be mummified crocodiles and the equipment and offerings associated with their cult preserved in the sealed chambers. And there is the question of the inscriptions and murals. Herodotus describes passing through rooms and corridors adorned with inscriptions and carved reliefs. If those decorations are present in the underground complex, they represent an extraordinary archive of 12th dynasty art and religion, texts and images that might tell us things about the theology and the administrative practice of this period that we have never been able to access. The 12th dynasty is a period of Egyptian history in which we know the kings and the general outlines of the political history, but the inner life of the culture and the specific religious practices, the theological debates, the personal and intimate aspects of royal life remains largely opaque. A decorated underground complex at Hawara might illuminate all of that. And there is the more speculative possibility, the one that generates excitement in popular archaeology, if not always in professional circles. The ancient Egyptians were meticulous record keepers. They wrote down everything: legal documents, medical texts, astronomical calculations, historical records, literary texts, religious rituals. For every papyrus that has survived, many more have been destroyed by fire, by flood, by the simple decay of organic material across 3,000 years. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous example of lost ancient knowledge, but it is not the only one. Could the underground complex at Hawara contain an archive, a library of papyri or inscribed stone, sealed and protected, representing the accumulated knowledge of the 12th dynasty? This is speculative. There is no ancient source that specifically describes an archive in the labyrinth. But it is not impossible. A building described as housing the business of governing Egypt as a kind of administrative heart of the empire would naturally accumulate records. Those records would naturally be stored somewhere, and if the underground complex was sealed and protected while everything above it was quarried and destroyed, those records might still be there. Still intact, still legible, still containing things that would change our understanding of the ancient world. Beneath the sand of Hawara, 8 to 12 meters down, behind a massive stone slab that has been sitting in the desert for nearly 4,000 years. Awaiting. Chapter 11, The Problem of Access. The Mataha expedition published its findings in 2008. The results were widely discussed in archaeological circles and eventually in popular media. And nothing happened. The Egyptian authorities did not permit excavation. The Supreme Council of Antiquities, the body responsible for managing Egypt's archaeological heritage, declined to authorize the physical investigation that would be necessary to determine what, if anything, was really beneath the massive stone slab at Hawara. This may seem frustrating from the perspective of pure discovery, of finding out what is there, but the Egyptian position is not entirely unreasonable. Egypt's archaeological heritage is vast and largely unmanaged. There are sites across the country where significant archaeological material sits in storage, undocumented, unstudied for decades after excavation. The human and financial resources necessary to properly excavate and conserve a major archaeological site are enormous, and a complex of the potential size of the labyrinth would require resources that dwarf almost any previous Egyptian excavation. Archaeological excavation is destruction. You can only excavate a site once. Once you break through that stone slab, once you open those chambers, whatever is inside will be exposed to air and light and the physical disturbance of excavation. If the conditions that have preserved the contents for 4,000 years are destroyed in the process of accessing them, the discovery becomes a catastrophe rather than a triumph. The Egyptian authorities are not wrong to be cautious, but caution has a cost. The rising water table at Hawara is real. The saline groundwater is rising, and it is dissolving ancient pigments and eroding ancient stone from below. The window of time in which the underground complex, if it exists in the form the radar data suggests, remains intact and accessible is not indefinite. The 2008 Mataha expedition's mission must continue. The labyrinth is not merely an archaeological site, it is a profound testament to human history, and its secrets must not remain buried beneath suppression and neglect. There is also the political dimension. Egypt's cultural heritage is a source of national pride and international soft power. The management of access to archaeological sites, who gets to excavate, who gets the credit for discoveries, how the finds are shared and published, is politically charged in ways that are not always visible from the outside. The labyrinth sits at the intersection of these tensions. International teams want access. Egyptian institutions want control. The question of who excavates and under what conditions is not merely technical. It is political. And so the slab sits at Hawara, the radar data sits in publications, the ancient descriptions sit in libraries and databases. And 8 to 12 meters below the surface of the Egyptian desert, something waits. Chapter 12, The Myth and the Reality. Pliny the Elder made the connection explicitly. The labyrinth of Crete, the mythological maze of Daedalus, the one that imprisoned the Minotaur, the one that Theseus navigated with Ariadne's thread, was modeled on the Egyptian one. Or rather, that Daedalus imitated only the 100th part of it. This is a striking formulation. The mythological labyrinth, the one that imprisoned a monster, that no one could escape without divine help, that was the supreme achievement of the greatest craftsman of the ancient world, was a pale shadow of the real Egyptian building. The real thing was 100 times more complex. Whether this is literally true, whether the architects of the mythological Cretan labyrinth were literally drawing on knowledge of the Egyptian complex, is impossible to determine. The mythological tradition of the labyrinth likely has multiple sources and a complex history of development. But the Egyptian complex at Hawara was known to the ancient Greeks from early on. Greek traders and mercenaries had been present in Egypt since at least the 7th century BC. The Fayum was a region with significant Greek settlement in the Ptolemaic period. The building at Hawara would have been accessible to Greek visitors for centuries before Herodotus made his famous visit. The memory of an incomprehensible building, full of passages that led nowhere and courts that opened into other courts, could easily have fed into the Greek mythological tradition of the labyrinth, the impossible maze as a concept. And the word itself, labyrinth, may preserve this connection. The etymology of the word is disputed. Some scholars derive it from an Aegean or Minoan root meaning house of the double axe, an image associated with Minoan Crete. Others have proposed a Lydian or Anatolian origin. Still others have suggested a connection to the Egyptian word loprohunt, an ancient name for the Fayum region. If the word labyrinth contains an Egyptian root, then the naming of the mythological Cretan maze after the Egyptian building is not merely Pliny's literary observation. It is encoded in the language itself. The word for the impossible maze is, at its deepest roots, the Egyptian building. The mythology of the labyrinth in this reading is a Greek transformation of an Egyptian reality. The monster in the maze is the displaced image of the crocodile god Sobek, whose sacred animals lived in the underground chambers that Herodotus was forbidden to enter. The hero Theseus navigating with his thread is the Greek version of the visitor requiring a guide, the person who enters the incomprehensible passages and cannot find their way without help. Speculative, yes. Impossible to prove, also yes. Interesting, deeply. The connections between the Egyptian labyrinth and the mythological tradition of the maze run through the deepest levels of Western culture, through the very words we use, through the stories we tell about heroes and monsters and impossible navigation. And at the root of all of it, 3,000 years ago, a pharaoh built a building beside a pyramid in the Fayum. Chapter 13, What the Silence Tells us. There is something extraordinary about the silence that surrounds the labyrinth. 6 witnesses, 3 centuries of documentation, descriptions of extraordinary precision and consistency. A building that was, by universal agreement, one of the most remarkable structures in the ancient world. And then nothing. No medieval Arab scholar mentions it. No Crusader traveler describes it. No Renaissance antiquarian record seeing it. The building that Herodotus said surpassed the pyramids simply ceases to appear in the historical record sometime after Pomponius Mela wrote about it in 43 AD. This silence is itself informative. It tells us that the above-ground structure was dismantled thoroughly enough that by the medieval period there was nothing visible to report. The debris field that Petrie found, the chips and fragments of stone, would have been unimpressive to a traveller who did not know what to look for. The pyramid of Amenemhat III was still there, still visible, but the great complex beside it had been reduced to rubble. The silence also tells us something about how quickly the memory of a monument can fade. The labyrinth was, in its time, one of the most famous buildings in the ancient world. It attracted visitors from across the Mediterranean. It was described in multiple languages by multiple observers, and within a few centuries of the last known visit, it had been dismantled so thoroughly that it ceased to be a visible presence in the landscape. This should give us pause when we consider what else might have been lost. If a building of this extraordinary scale and fame could be so completely erased from the physical landscape, while its descriptions survived in texts that were copied and preserved, what about the buildings that were never described? What about the monuments that attracted no Greek or Roman visitors, that were never documented in languages that subsequent civilizations could read? The labyrinth's disappearance is a reminder of how much of the ancient world we have simply lost. Not lost in the sense of not knowing where it is, but lost in the sense of never having known it existed. The Egyptian labyrinth survived as a story because the ancient writers found it remarkable enough to describe in detail. Other buildings, equally remarkable, may have existed and been destroyed and never described. The labyrinth is the one we know about. It is both a specific mystery and a window onto the general condition of ancient history, the vast proportion of human achievement that has simply vanished, leaving no trace in any language. Except this time perhaps there is a trace, below the surface, beneath the slab. 8 to 12 meters down. Chapter 14, The Future of the Labyrinths. The question of what happens next with the labyrinth is genuinely open. The Mataha expedition's radar data from 2008 has never been fully published. The research stopped, the excavation was not permitted, and the full data set has not been released to the broader archaeological community in the way that would allow independent verification and analysis. This is a problem. Science advances through the sharing of data and the replication of results. If the radar data shows what the expedition claimed it showed, a vast underground complex consistent with the ancient descriptions, then independent analysis of that data would be enormously valuable. And if independent analysis confirmed the finding, the pressure on Egyptian authorities to permit proper excavation would be significantly greater. The technology for investigating the site non-invasively has also improved significantly since 2008. More recent generations of ground-penetrating radar are more precise. Satellite-based imaging can reveal subsurface features that previous technology missed. LiDAR scanning can create detailed three-dimensional maps of subsurface structures. A modern survey of the Hawara site, using the best available technology, would provide a much more detailed picture of what is beneath the debris field, and might resolve the question of whether the 2008 findings represented a genuine underground complex or a natural geological formation. The rising water table remains a genuine threat. Modern ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging have detected subterranean anomalies in the area, but political instability and environmental conditions have made further excavation difficult. If the underground complex at Hawara is being eroded by saline groundwater, the window for investigation is limited. This creates an argument for urgency that is independent of archaeological curiosity. If the site is being damaged by groundwater and there is evidence that this is happening, then investigation is also preservation. The case for excavation is not merely that we want to know what is there, but that if we do not investigate soon, what is there may be lost. The Egyptian government faces genuine competing pressures: the desire to maintain control over the country's cultural heritage, the need to manage a vast number of archaeological sites with limited resources, the political sensitivity of allowing foreign institutions to excavate significant sites, and the genuine technical challenge of doing justice to a site of this potential importance. These are real pressures and real constraints. But somewhere beneath the sand of Hawara, the evidence suggests there is something that has been waiting for nearly 4,000 years. Something that 6 ancient writers tried to describe and could not fully capture. Something that might, if the radar data is correct, if the interpretation of the stone slab as a roof rather than a foundation is right, be the most significant undiscovered archaeological site in the world. Still sealed, still protected, still there. Closing the building beneath the sand. And so the story of the Lost Labyrinth of Egypt comes to rest. Not to a resolution, not to an ending, to a pause, a place where the story is still open, where the mystery is still genuine, where the most important chapter may not yet have been written. 3,900 years since Amenemhat III began its construction, 2,500 years since Herodotus stood in its courts and ran out of words, 140 years since Flinders Petrie found the debris field and the massive stone slab, 16 years since the ground-penetrating radar found the grid of walls and chambers 8 to 12 meters below the surface. And still waiting. The labyrinth may be the greatest thing we have not yet found, or it may be a natural geological formation that the radar data has been misinterpreted, or it may be the remains of the above-ground complex, preserved underground in a form that Petrie did not find in the 1880s. So we do not know. What we know is this. 6 people saw it. They described it in terms that still astonish 3,000 years later. They said it surpassed the pyramids. They said the roofs were single stones. They said no one could navigate it without a guide. They said the underground chambers held the tombs of pharaohs and the sacred crocodiles of a god. And something is down there. The radar has shown us something. Let those images settle now, like sand drifting over old stone. Herodotus in the great courts, looking up at the roof of single stones, reaching for words that did not come. Strabo with his notebook, measuring and recording the passages that twisted and turned so that no one could enter without a guide. Pliny making the connection to the Cretan myth, understanding that the mythological maze was a pale shadow of this real one. Flinders Petrie in his excavation trench, finding the massive slab and calling it a foundation, not yet understanding what it might be the roof of. The scientists in 2008, watching the radar data appear on their screens, the grid of walls and chambers resolving at 8 to 12 meters depth, understanding what they might be looking at. The ground at Hawara still patient, the slab in place. Whatever is beneath it has waited nearly 4,000 years. It can wait a little longer, but not perhaps much longer. The water is rising, and sleep, a soft, deep, dreamless sleep. Good night.